when it comes to excretion, really the most important part of the body is the nephron, and there's a diagram of a nephron shown here, and actually they're inside our kidneys, and it's actually an animation, so we can see here we've got a kidney with an artery coming in and a venule coming out, might be arteriole rather. So we're going to sort of zoom in here. And we're about to see, so here is a nephron unit. It's just showing one here, but we've got millions of these inside the kidney. So what we can do now is sort of zoom in on the nephron, go back to this diagram, and we can see here that different things go through the nephron. And the real purpose of the nephron is that blood comes in here from this so-called afferent, that's afferent with an A, arteriole, and the blood comes in and it goes into this thing called the renal capsule, and more specifically, this part here is called the glomerulus, which is not actually labelled on this diagram. But so what happens is the blood comes in through the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, and this is under really high pressure, and so-called ultrafiltration takes place here, where a few things are sort of forced out of the blood. Now actually proteins, we can watch what happens with a protein here if we press start. They're actually too big to fit through the glomerulus, so they actually will stay in the blood, and we can see here this becomes a capillary, so this arteriole becomes a sort of a capillary over here. The red bit here is the sort of the network of blood, or the capillary, which is lying over the bit in brown here, or orange, which is actually the nephron tubules. And we'll go through what happens here, but again, yeah, proteins don't actually ever make it into through the glomerulus and into the rest of the nephron. They're just kept in the bloodstream mostly. If we do need to basically excrete some proteins, I should mention here too, so the whole point of this is the blood comes in, and a lot of the time it's water that's coming out. It can be glucose, urea, or sodium. A lot of it's water, and it gets squeezed out here or in the ultrafiltration process. So a lot of water gets squeezed out of the blood and all this water ends up in this tubule here, which is part of the nephron, and it comes down here and back up and around here, and then out here, and then this actually goes down to the bladder. So the kidney and the nephrons inside them more specifically are really the way that our bladder gets full. Basically the nephrons taking the blood and filtering different things out of it. And sometimes they stay in this tubule and they make it all the way to the bladder. But as we'll see in a moment, depending on what the situation is in our body, sometimes we actually want to reabsorb a lot of that water. Like it's always going to get forced out of the blood and into this tubule, but it may not be the case that we actually want that water to make it to the bladder. So there are mechanisms, especially in this bit here, the loop of Henle, there are mechanisms where we can actually keep a lot of that water if we want to. We can reabsorb it back into the blood. And the same thing can happen with sodium and also glucose if we want. Urea we don't tend to uptake that. By the time urea is made, then it's not going to be reabsorbed. Our body generally wants to get rid of it. And just quickly, we're going to come back to this nephron, but speaking of urea, there is, in terms of excretion, there's one other organ where it plays a pretty important role, and that's actually the liver. So we're looking at the liver here. And we don't need to worry about the details of this, except here it's a deamination, okay? So we're actually deaminating an amino acid, and those amino acids would have come from a protein that got broken down, because proteins are made of amino acids. So if our body decides we need to get rid of some protein, it'll break it down to amino acids. And then the job of the liver is to actually do this so-called deamination process of the amino acid, which we don't need to know the details of, except that it makes this ammonia sort of intermediate. And that's pretty toxic, so it keeps it in the liver. and then combines it with carbon dioxide. Again, not too important, but urea is what it makes in the end. And then that urea goes in the blood and then can be excreted by the kidney. But it's the liver that makes the urea by breaking down proteins. Okay, so that's the liver and so-called deamination of amino acids. Okay, so back here, let's look at water. No, actually, let's look at urea just quickly because we were just talking about urea. So this little sphere here, we can follow it actually. So it's going to go, it did get ultrafiltrated, and now it's going through, and we can see it's tracking it when there's going to be no reuptake of this. So it's going to stay in the nephron tubule, and it's going to make it all the way through. And it's going to end up definitely going to the bladder. All right, but that's not the case necessarily with other things. For instance, let's try glucose. So it's that yellow dot here, and let's follow that. And again, it makes it into the nephron, goes through to this proximal convoluted tubule, but see how then it switched to the blood? So that actually got reabsorbed. It's the case here that the body decided, no, we want to keep that glucose, so it got reabsorbed. It made it through, it got ultrafiltrated in the glomerulus, made it into the tubule, but then it basically diffused out of the tubule, this proximal convoluted tubule, diffused out of that and into this capillary and back into the blood. So never made it to the bladder. Okay, if we had heaps of glucose in our body, it could be the case that we do want to excrete some of that. In which case, the sort of the gates here that let out glucose would be closed. So the glucose wouldn't get out, and it would actually make it all the way through the tubule and end up in the bladder. Okay, so with water, let's try water. And we'll see here, we follow the water, it goes through, it's going a bit fast. We'll see there's a little bit of uptake here. And then it happened very fast, but here, it's actually, if we just sort of pause that, there was a point here, there's a little bit of water came out here out of the proximal convoluted tubule, but really with water reabsorption, when our body decides we want to keep that water, we don't want it to go to the bladder, in other words, maybe we're dehydrated, and we really want to reabsorb that water, then this loop of Henle, and see how it comes out of the glomerulus and the renal capsule, the fluid comes through here, goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, where glucose in particular can be reabsorbed, but a bit of everything gets reabsorbed here. And then it comes down to the loop of Henle, this bit here, and this so-called descending limb, this is really where the water can be reabsorbed. So if it needs to, a lot of the water will come out of the nephron tubule and back into the blood supply here, and go on and back to the body through this venule here. So, it's the descending limb here. Now, conversely, could watch it again. It can be a bit hard to see in this, but if we do sodium, let's get rid of the water and play that. So this is sodium. So it makes it in there, goes through here. A little bit comes out there, but it's actually this ascending limb here. So notice how some sodium came out and got reabsorbed back into the body. And actually, some of that sodium will stay in the kidney as well. But yeah, so it's the ascending limb. This bit here, ascending limb of the nephron. This is where a lot of sodium can come out. Whereas here, the descending limb, it's water. We're talking about water coming out of the descending limb. Okay, and then from there, it sort of goes to this bit, and this bit that goes off to the bladder is actually called the collecting duct. And up here we've got this distal convoluted tubule, and there is a bit of exchange there. Sometimes some toxins can come in there to get excreted, but we won't talk about that bit too much for now. But it is called the distal convoluted tubule. And then we got the loop of Henle with the ascending limb here coming on its way to the bladder, and the descending limb of the loop of Henle, which has come from the proximal convoluted tubule here. And then back up here, we've got the renal capsule, and this is the glomerulus. And then we've got the afferent arteriole. And then actually coming out of here, this is still arteriole, because this then goes into the capillaries here, and then eventually to the venule here. But here, this is called the afferent with an A goes into the glomerulus. See how it's coming out here? This is actually called the efferent with an E, efferent. So there's afferent and then efferent arterioles. Comes out, and then that arteriole becomes a capillary, ready there, sitting next to the tubule there, ready to reabsorb things if they're going to be reabsorbed. Remember, they can be, like water and glucose and sodium can all, like they can be reabsorbed into the blood, or they can make it all the way through the tubule here and make it to the bladder. Urea, which has been formed in the liver, will generally always make it all the way through to the bladder. And proteins, they're too big. They don't even make it through the glomerulus in the ultrafiltration process. You can have a look at this animation here too. It's just at this address here, and it might be helpful too.